Hello, my name is Mike Hoffman, and I'm a professor emeritus at Cornell University. And I've been in this space of climate change and its impact on food for some time. And the idea of using food, the power of food to get people's attention about climate change is getting a lot of attention. So that's the story I'm going to tell, is basically how our food is changing because of climate change, using that as a messenger of climate change, and then what we can do to keep our favorite foods on the table. So with that, I will share my screen and begin my presentation. And thank you for joining me. So using the power of food to tackle climate change. We're in trouble. On the 27th of July, UN Secretary General made the following statement. The era of global warming has ended. The era of global boiling has arrived. No more excuses. No more waiting for others to move first. There is simply no more time for that. We need to act now. So there's many different ways to tell the climate change story. You can make it personal. Your grandchildren, your children. Talk about the economy, biodiversity. But I struggle to find something more relevant than food. We all eat several times a day. It's part of our culture, our family tradition. It's emotional. I'm not sure about you, but I get emotional over really good food. So we enjoy it. Those beverages, alcoholic beverages, they're called social lubricants. They kind of help us get along with others over a beverage at a bar. It's easy to talk about our beverage at home. We talk about food. It's easy to talk about it. My two daughters and my spouse, that's all they talk about when they're together, is food. So the stories to tell are unlimited. And who should hear this story? It's the rich world. We made this mess, especially the US, and we've got the capacity to make a difference. And the first point to make is, so where does food come from? Well, basically it comes from everywhere, but it's also people. There are people involved in our food system globally. Don't ever forget that. It's just not a location. Somebody out there harvesting, planting. So in the upper left, local farmers market. We can buy fresh fruit and vegetables produced probably within 30 miles. Upper right is a young woman pollinating vanilla beans. Yes, each blossom has to be pollinated by hand to produce natural vanilla. A dairy farmer in North Carolina producing milk for our ice cream. The gentleman with the hat, an Australian growing grass-fed beef in Australia, most of which ends up coming to the US. We import a lot of grass-fed beef from around the world. Lower left, Florida. Family, back the Hill family, growing blueberries. And there's another family in lower right in Western Africa growing cacao for our chocolate, making all of $4 a day. In the US, 1 in 75 people are employed as ranchers or farmers. That's 1.3 of our population. 98% of our farms are family farms. A few feed many. Some information from Florida. There's actually almost 48,000 commercial farms in Florida. You wouldn't think of it from the typical scene we get of Miami Beach, etc. Annual production, receipts worth about close to $8 billion, and they're the 21st state in the US when it comes to agricultural production. Florida's an important player. Here's some stories to tell, and I can't say that enough, but everything is changing for the plants we depend on for life. They need air, specifically carbon dioxide, water, temperature, soil, and sunlight, but everything is changing except sunlight. And I'm going to give some examples. The increase in carbon dioxide, which by the way is up 50% higher than it should be, has pretty interesting impacts on crops. In fact, they benefit from it. It's almost a fertilization effect. And people will say, well, climate change, that's good for agriculture. Look, bigger crops, bigger yields. But the consensus is it's most likely going to be offset by more extremes in temperature and drought. Weeds will actually become more difficult to control over time with increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. But the bottom one is probably the most important. In a lot of the crops that we depend on, it is predicted that there will be less protein, vitamins, and minerals in coming decades. Rice, for example, vitamin B's in rice will decline by 30%, and tens of millions of people depend on rice for their nutrition. The implications here are profound. But in vegetables, there's actually some positive news. So all of these compounds, fructose, glucose, soluble sugar, antioxidant capacity, phenols, flavonoids, ascorbic acid, are predicted to increase in vegetables as CO2 increases in the atmosphere. Hard to imagine, but kale might even taste better. In Florida, they produce a lot of vegetables, including 54% of the fresh market tomatoes that we consume in the US. Changes in water, where water falls, how it falls, and in what form it falls and when it falls is changing. Global shifts, more extremes. We see this all the time, more downpours than in droughts. They call it the precipitation whiplash. California, many years of drought, and then this year, floods, and late last year. Italy, 2 years of drought. This year, 5,000 farms flooded with excessive precipitation. And it's the darndest thing, but ice melts when it gets warm. And the US imports about $5 billion worth of agricultural products from Peru and Chile every year. Some of that production is dependent on meltwaters from the ice cap in the Andes for irrigation. That ice cap can be gone in about 20 years or less. There goes the irrigation water. For the crops, like blueberries, that I love from Peru or Chile during the wintertime in New York. Where it falls, there's the drought monitor from a couple of weeks ago. You can see there's still an exceptional drought in part of Texas and surrounding areas, and severe to extreme drought elsewhere across the central part of the US. The new norm, so to speak, the new abnormal. And then looking towards the end of the century, the rule of thumb is that wet areas today will get wetter, dry areas today drier. So if you look at the US, you can see the Northeast, it's going to get wetter. We've already gained 5 inches of rain per year in the Northeast, but the rest of the country is going to get drier. Even hail in some areas is going to get larger and more damaging. That little ice crystal gets thrown around up in the upper atmosphere. There's more turbulence up there, so that little crystal gets thrown up into the cold air more often, and each time it does, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and down comes a very large hail, posing risk to hop production, let's say in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere. Another story to tell. Variations in temperature, yeah, everybody knows it's warming. Hard to avoid with all the records broken this last summer, but it's not simple. One of the interesting things is most fruit and all nut trees require a winter chill or a cold temperature such that induces dormancy in the tree. Without that, they don't produce. In 2017, there were hardly any peaches in Georgia because the previous winter was too warm. This year, there are hardly any peaches in Georgia, which by the way is the peach state, the same thing. But two things did. One was last winter was too warm. And then the peach trees that did blossom were hit by something called a false spring. It was warm, blossoms came out, then a frost arrived and killed the blossoms. Production again this year is way down. Another thing that's happening in Georgia, 10 years ago, they had about 5,000 citrus trees. Now they have 500,000. Does that mean they're moving out of Florida? I'm not sure, but that's a huge shift. Citrus production is really expanding in Georgia. Nights warming faster than days, and that's because of cloud cover. There's more moisture in the atmosphere, and it holds the heat around the earth, but it means warmer nights. And cattle need to cool off. They got a hot day, and add to that a hot night. That's not good for their health. More heat waves. We've seen that. In the past, the prediction was about every 100 years, the Midwest, the wheat producing area of the US, would be hit with high temperatures. Now, the prediction is every 6 years. Hang on to your bread. So let's just look at Florida, what's happened there in 22 and 23 with intensified storms, intensified hurricanes. So in 2022, Ian hit all kinds of crops, vegetables, melons, knocked over bee colonies, damaged 380,000 bee colonies. And the trees, like shown on the right, had blossoms, but the storm knocked off the blossoms, let alone the fruit. So major losses for oranges and other citrus in Florida, the source of 95% of the US's orange juice. Down fences. Well, that's kind of odd. The trees were knocked down the fences, the cattle escaped. Flooded pastures, not good for cattle. And of course, barns knocked over, ditches washed out, you name it. Most recently, the Hurricane Idalia, about $80 million in damage. It impacted roughly 500,000 acres of farmland, but most of it this time focused on animal agriculture, beef, dairy, poultry, honey from beehives, and shellfish aquaculture. That image tells it all. I'd hate to be that farmer. And it's not just production, it's also getting it from where it's produced to the table. The middle picture is the Mississippi River last year, which was in a drought. Hard to imagine barges moving down that river in the fall, when, in fact, most of the grains from the Great Plains are being exported by barge, which couldn't happen. Cost about $20 billion extra because they had to use other kinds of transportation to move the grain for export. On the right, I wrote an op-ed a few years ago about the Suez Canal because it was blocked by a ship, nothing to do with climate change, but now the Panama Canal. There are hundreds of ships waiting to get into the Panama Canal. They can't move them through fast because there isn't enough water because of a long-term drought, affecting billions of dollars of goods and produce, etc., being transported through that canal. To the left, that white area, looking at the left half of the image, is a summer sea ice about September. It should actually extend out to that yellow line, but from a transport viewpoint, it now means, or soon will mean, that you can ship products, produce, from Northern Asia to Northern Europe in about 40% less time. Another change to getting food to the table. Let's look at the menu. Everything pictured here is changing when I'm talking about the food components of these images. And let's dive into this a little bit. Social lubricants, water-dependent industry, that's changing. Wine grapes are very sensitive to high temperature. It changes the acidity, sugar content, flavor of the wine, aroma of the wine. Beer, well, a few years ago, the drought in California was having a huge impact on craft brewers who depended on surface water. Well, because of the drought, the mineral content in that surface water changed and affected the flavor of the beers. Well, let's look at something relevant to Florida, the rum runner. one of the most popular drinks in Florida. What's changing? Well, rum. This is I like a fun story. Rum is aged in oak barrels, and some of that evaporates through the barrel. Well, in the hotter part of the world, where rum is aged, you can lose up to 10% of that by volume. Less so where it's cooler. But, excuse me, it's getting warmer. So there's going to be more loss of rum as it ages, simply because it's warmer because of climate change. I mentioned oranges already. Pineapples get oddly shaped when the temperature is too high. They may also blossom, which means you may not get the fruit you need. Bananas, same thing. Higher temps and less water have a severe impact on production of bananas, but irrigation can offset that. There's sugar in banana liqueur, but it comes from sugar beets. How many people realize that about 60% of the sugar in the US actually comes from sugar beets, which are huge beets compared to the traditional red beet we're used to. Grenadine. Pomegranate juice, I couldn't find a lot as to what's happening except in Afghanistan, kind of the cradle where pomegranates started. There, because of drought, basically the land available to grow pomegranate trees is shrinking. Blackberry and cherries. Let's go back to the lack of winter chill affects both cherries and blackberries, and ice, back to the story of water. Salads. This is a Florida salad. Tomatoes are predicted to get sweeter. Onions, more pungent. Lettuce, where we can grow it in the US, will expand in coming years because of warming winters. Cheese, I love the story, hot cows give less milk. And olives. These are from Spain. Prices are going up. They're really challenged in Spain to produce the olives at the level they used to produce them because of the drought. Mains, all kinds of options here. We're looking at seafood. Well, in coming years, there's likely to be more octopus and squid on the menu because they do well in warmer waters. Some of our current seafood choices now will likely decline. Chicken, probably okay, especially in the US where they're mostly grown in controlled environment facilities. In the middle, a juicy steak. But with all the droughts, especially in Texas, for example, grazing lands are in trouble. So the farmers can't graze cattle, and add to that higher temperatures. And other options shown here. The vegetables, already mentioned what's going on with the chemical components of vegetables, lots of changes underway. But once again, let's come to Florida for a look at the Cuban sandwich, the most popular meal in Florida, according to some data I found. Pork. Wow, what can go wrong with pigs? Well, just like humans, the smoke from Canada affects their health, as it does dairy cattle and beef cattle. Cumin, most of it comes from India, but huge changes in India, not only cumin, but a lot of other spices because of changes in weather conditions, the rainfalls at different times, more extreme weather, higher temperatures. Olive oil, I mentioned, and connected to Spain. Garlic, the story there is to feed it to cattle, they produce less methane. Basically, chilies in general will get hotter with hotter and drier conditions. Orange juice we touched on. The bread, think of wheat and the nutritional loss, the nutritional declines. Dijon mustard, last year there was a shortage of Dijon mustard because of a drought in Western Canada, for a reduced yield of commercial mustard. Lots of stories. Just look at the sandwich and start teasing things apart and tell your friends. That's the whole idea. Sides, we talked about wheat and all the breads, rice we touched on. And think of the spices, all of the spices that come from primarily India and Asia are slowly changing. The picture of the potato chips above are actually the fish and chips, the chips and fish and chips. They were shorter a couple of years ago in the UK because of a drought and high temperatures. People noticed, what's going on with my chips? They're not as big as they used to be. Desserts and coffee. Strawberry shortcake is now Florida's official state dessert. And the only ingredient I'm going to pick up on it is in the shortcakes is vanilla extract. Most vanilla comes from Madagascar. A few years ago, the price went up 350% because of a shortage. By the way, 99% of the vanilla we use is synthetic, 1% is natural. But the changes in Madagascar with additional hurricanes and so on is having an impact on the production of natural vanilla. Strawberries are predicted to decline somewhat in Florida, and whipped cream back to cows give less milk when they're hot. Coffee, it's hard to talk about, but changes, big changes for coffee. So this is serious. Imagine a world without ice cream. There would be darkness and chaos. And melting glaciers are bad enough, but the loss of coffee is, for me and many others, downright terrifying. You got to do something. So we asked the question. We did a survey, a national survey in the US. Does anybody care? So we asked questions like, are you very or fairly concerned about food choices and how climate change is affecting those food choices? Well, 86% of the Democrats said yes, and 61% of the Republicans said they're concerned. Are you willing to pay more for a food grown with climate-friendly practices? Results are quite similar. Are you interested in learning more about the impacts of climate change on your food? Likewise, similar results. But this opens a door. There's an audience here. It's across the political divide. People care about their food, and they're concerned about how climate change is affecting their favorite foods and other foods, their staples. But then you ask, is climate change a crisis? 59% of Democrats said yes, only 20% of the Republicans. What a contrast when you use food as a messenger versus just climate change alone. I think we have an audience here. We have an opportunity to reach across the divide. And then we ask, do you talk about food often or occasionally? And 3/4 of people do. And do you talk about climate change? Only 35%. Can we bring these conversations together and get people to talk about climate change using food to tackle climate change? So here we are. The title of this was Using Food to Tackle Climate Change. And I love the synonyms: challenge, confront, stop, bring down, block, face. We can do all of these things, or we can put our heads in the sand. So what's being done? Farmers are adapting something called climate smart farming. And one farmer said, Mike, that's common sense farming. That's what we need to be doing. To focus on the soil, health of the soil. You got too much water, not enough. So how do you manage that? Diversify where you can. So if you got multiple crops and you lose a few because of climate change, you still have a income. And Florida actually has a climate smart farming working group. The food and beverage businesses are starting to do their part. They're looking at the supply chain for the sake of their business. Wait a minute, I get my ingredient, raw product from such and such a place. What's going on there? Maybe I ought to invest and help those farmers. In fact, companies are doing that. They're also looking at alternative ingredients and reducing their own impact on the climate. And science, developing resilient varieties. In Florida, they're looking at hybrid strawberries that are more tolerant to high temperatures. Again, soil health, modeling, looking at the future, what's up next for farmers, etc. A lot going on. People are doing a lot. Thousands of people around the world are trying to keep your favorite foods on the plate. What can we all do? I like to say, find your greater purpose. Start with talk about it and use food. Understand what's going on. Become climate change literate so you can make informed decisions. Focus on what matters. There's a lot of little things we can do, but right now we need to focus on those plus bigger issues. Look at your retirement funds. How are they invested? Get involved. Find out what you're best at and do it. Are you good at poetry, music, public speaking, writing opinion pieces? Run with it. We need you. And be the first. on the block, so to speak, because peer pressure works. If you do something and tell somebody else, they're going to think, maybe I should do that too. And as Greta says, no one is too small to make a difference. By the way, she weighs 105 pounds. So here you have food, a common ground, consumers, chefs, restaurateurs, food industry, food media producers. We don't see any villains. We all eat. Let's join forces and I'll tell this story. Using the power of food, create a great awakening, created a much deeper state of awareness and need for action on climate change using food. We need to act quickly and at scale. Hey, we all eat. Empowers the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others for the course of events. Food has power. Use the power of food to keep the planet livable. Hey, if you love that champagne, if you love that favorite Chardonnay, we got to reduce the emissions of fossil fuels quickly. We can use food to help people realize the growing risks. We all eat. Let's create a global network. Change lifestyles, such as diets. Educate others in new, improved ways. And when it comes to diet, the approach we take to red meat is simply treat it as a delicacy, not a staple. That would make a huge difference. So we've written a book, Our Changing Menu. The core of the book is literally a menu with the courses of the meal from before dinner drinks all the way through to coffee and desserts. There's a website with 2 databases. One focuses on food ingredients. The other is plant-based products like textiles made out of cotton, perfumes, cosmetics, pet food, all changing. Got your attention? Tell those stories. And what about a dining experience? What if we all occasionally get together with others and have a meal and start talking about what's changing on your plate? This is a great way to start talking about climate change and find solutions. Hey, I'm really worried about coffee. What can we do? Let's talk about it. So the background for this kind of discussion, be our book, website. We also created a storytelling cookbook to help people tell stories about food and what's happening. The outcomes of these, more people are informed about climate change. They're going to talk about it. Hopefully they're empowered and able to cope. They can start multiplying the message using food. So if you go to a meal and have this experience, then have your own meal with your friends. And we're saving our favorites. And by the way, we're keeping the planet livable. I like to call this wildfire. And again, as the Secretary General states, no more waiting for others to move first. There is simply no more time for that. Thank you. I thank you all for joining me. And through Huva, please send questions to me, comments. I look forward to that. And I wish you the best. Please keep up the climate change fight. Consider using food, maybe even a climate change food fight. At this point, what the heck? Thank you very much.